Okay, so book three of the Republic, and here we can move a little bit more quickly, just identify some of the broad points. First of all, throughout book three, the education that they describe in terms of speeches, in terms of music, in terms of the types of poetry that they'll allow, almost all of it is designed to make the citizens more moderate, more courageous, especially at first. As time goes on, also more moderate. So there's no great laughter, also no great sorrow, no great lamenting. The music too needs to be moderate, not too sensual, not too sad, not too, again, as he puts it, the lamenting or the wailing mode. All of these things should be left out. Everything should be relatively moderate, making the citizens, again, relatively moderate, and also therefore prepared to be obedient. Obedience to the rulers becomes a very important theme in book three. And again, they start out with book three really focusing on making the warriors and the citizens more courageous. In this case, by controlling what can be said about the afterlife. And again, Socrates goes after Homer and looks at what Homer had said in the Iliad, looks at several passages, including the famous line that Achilles says to Odysseus when Achilles is in the underworld, and Odysseus comes down and sees him, and Achilles said, "I would rather be a slave to a poor person on the earth than rule in Hades." The idea here, especially in Homer, is that Hades was just very bad for everybody. And Socrates quotes many examples from Homer of saying how bad the afterlife was. People were just shadows or shades of their former self. They were irrational. The word gibbering keeps coming up in this translation. That they lost their mind and they just became very irrational, frightened. Again, just shadows of themselves. And Socrates says this is terrible. No, people are going to fear death if this is what they think that it's like, and they may end up then fearing death more than defeat or more than slavery. So they may choose slavery, they may choose defeat in battle rather than death if they think that it's this terrible. So he sort of says we need to make the people more courageous. Now, this was sort of this conversation was going on at the height of Athens' imperial greatness. I mean, they were fighting with Sparta, so maybe it wasn't quite the pure height, but they were doing pretty well. So in some ways, the argument that these beliefs will make people, that hearing these things will make people cowardly. I mean, again, the great Greek triumphs against the Persians, everybody was, Homer was part of the culture. So the idea that this will somehow ruin people for being good soldiers is somewhat debatable. And so possibly Socrates is using this more as a stalking horse, and for whatever reason wants to take away fear of death, wants to make the citizens less fearful of death, and therefore is using, well, we need courageous warriors as a way to do that, as a reason to do that, and therefore, again, controlling what can be said about the afterlife and saying, look, we can't tell them that it's a terrible place. We can't tell them that they'll be very unhappy or terrified and miserable there. We need to sort of present it as something not to be feared. And throughout, book three, as he describes the education, the medicine, everything else, he takes a very cavalier view towards death. I mean, at one point he says something like, the decent man would least of all be affected by the loss of a friend or a comrade, both because he doesn't think death is terrible, and also because he's self-sufficient. So he would be relatively undisturbed by losing a good friend or a comrade. Socratic medicine turns out to be very, very Spartan. Just very little. You give somebody some wine with barley and grated cheese, and if that cures them, great. If not, they just die. And he sort of, as he puts it, they just die and they're rid of their troubles. That's not the only cure he suggests. You can take an emetic, you can be bled, but he basically says, if somebody doesn't recover with very basic medicine, then he says, then they just die and they're rid of their troubles, and that's good for them. He contrasts the attitude of working people who have serious things to do, he says, and therefore can't afford to lay around and be sick, with the attitude of wealthier people who, he says, really focus on their illness and really sort of are constantly, in some cases, constantly worried about it. And he says, and the worst of all about these people is that they don't study them. They're constantly on the lookout for headaches and tension, and they're always worried that it was thinking or studying that caused that. So they become, they're not at all interested in studying or philosophy or anything like that. So he says, much better is to have the attitude that you should be healthy, and if you're sick, do a very basic remedy, and if that doesn't cure you, well, you're better off just dying than being sick all of the time. Which again, very not a very reassuring, or not a very obviously not a very sympathetic or obviously not doing a lot to sort of help people get better if they don't already have good health. And he goes on. He also says, that the criminal justice that they'll practice too, just killing people if they're not good. That if their souls are sick and can't be cured, well, then we'll just kill them. So I mean, it's sort of a lot of people are dying in this city, and that seems to be okay with Socrates. I mean, again, it's all a city and speech, but it's a surprisingly harsh place. And so, anyways, as they sort of go on, they continue to talk about the education. Throughout, there's a kind of censoring of Achilles, who had been the model for the Greeks, the model of a Greek warrior, in many ways the model of Greek citizenship, the model of what a Greek man should be. Socrates is extremely critical of him, not just for what he says in Hades, but for being disobedient. The entire Iliad begins with Homer saying, calling for inspiration, from the goddess to sort of tell him, tell about the story when Achilles' wrath meant that he refused to fight, and it killed, all these Achaeans then died because Achilles refused to fight with them. And Socrates says, this is an example of someone who was disobedient. He was too proud. He was not obedient to his rulers. We shouldn't hold this up. We shouldn't hold him up as a model. We should have a very different type of model. Again, Achilles shouldn't be it. So he talks about all kinds of things, involving the afterlife, involving, again, the presentation, very much focused on people being moderate and oftentimes obedient to the rulers. Again, focuses a lot on the need for making people courageous. If the stories at the end of book 2 were more for the sake of a correct understanding of the gods and for making people just and so on, now the focus is much more on courage and moderation and obedience. He says, above all, we have to not let the poets depict the gods as suffering or lamenting. He uses examples again from Homer, where Zeus is upset that one of his favorite mortals is going to die, and again, it comes down to being concerned about death. And Socrates says we need to, as much as possible, stop people from feeling that way, which of course might seem almost impossible or almost inhuman. And so here we see this, kind of developing this sort of very intense version of citizenship and very intense version of a city. And again, there's not supposed to be much lamentation or real tragedy in the city, but there's also not supposed to be great laughter either. They shouldn't be lovers of laughter. He says when people laugh too much, they're wishing for some kind of great change. So there shouldn't be either extreme, and also, again, severe limits on imitation, on what can be imitated in sound, what kinds of drama and so on is acceptable. At one point, Socrates says at 389b, he says the truth must be taken seriously, by which he means that the rulers can lie, but others are strictly forbidden to lie. The ruled people in the city have to tell the truth to the rulers, just like you have to tell the truth to your doctor. He says, the truth must be taken seriously. We can't let people lie to the rulers, but again, it is okay that if the rulers themselves lie. And again, it's not just when he talks about the limitations on the type of literature in the city. He's not just talking about different types of poetry or drama. He's also talking about the types of music. And he says, if music is either too sensual, too much devoted to pleasure, or sounds too much that way, or if it's too sad, if it's in a kind of lamenting mode, he says in either one of these cases that can't happen. And you might say, well, this is odd. I mean, Socrates is the philosopher. Why is this happening? And his argument is that actually music sort of shapes the soul, gives it a particular tenor. He says the musical education itself doesn't make them rational, but it prepares them for reason. So here his idea is clearly, reason isn't totally separated from the rest of the self, from the rest of the soul, from the rest of the psyche. The emotions that people experience within themselves affect reason and affect their ability to be reasonable, their receptiveness to reason. So he says one of the things we have to do is educate them correctly to make sure that, again, that they are of a certain character and therefore that they're prepared to accept reason. Again, the musical education by itself doesn't make them rational. It's obviously not teaching them to be rational. It's not quite an education in reason or making them more reasonable, but it prepares them for reason. And he says, this is important, that if they haven't been prepared in the right way, they won't be receptive to reason. And he actually says that this will be so, that if this is really good and effective at 403b, he even says that then they will actually limit themselves in their love affairs, that if they've been correctly educated and they think that sexual pleasure is too extreme, too mad, and they think that kind of madness should never be part of love, then for the most part, he says they'll at least be reputed. They won't do anything that will lead them to be reputed to have done anything beyond just kissing and touching and so on. Again, whether that's actually possible or whether that's actually possible or not, much like the question of whether or not people could actually move as far away as he wants them to from being both worried about their own death and sad when someone close to them dies. I mean, obviously this is a question. He goes on, and he also says that any society that honors doctors and lawyers, he says, is fundamentally sick. It's obviously especially interesting for American readers, maybe the two most honored professions in our society, doctors and lawyers. He says that if people are too devoted to medicine, if people are relatively healthy, then they don't need doctors. If they're really taking doctors seriously, if they're really honoring that as a profession, it's a sign that that it's a sick society, not just physically sick, but that there's something wrong, that it's given over too much to luxury and so on. And he says it's even worse with lawyers if they're sort of any society that sort of has lawyers who figure out how to manipulate the law, how to trick people in law courts and so on, and then they're proud of that. Again, he says that that's a very bad sign about that person. And in any society that honors these types of people and takes them seriously and looks up to them, he says, again, it's a very bad sign about that society. First of all, that it needs law courts and it needs laws, that it's so unjust that you need all of these things to actually make the society function. And then the way that they look at it is as something to be manipulated, and therefore they honor lawyers because they're able to do that. So throughout, he sort of gives different examples. Homer, who couldn't get anything right when it came to the gods or justice, is suddenly his authority on medicine and nutrition. Homer knows what people should eat, and when they're sick, his cure is, again, wine with some barley and cheese. Even Glaucon is a little bit. It's a strange thing to give someone who's been wounded, but Socrates says, no, it's right. So Homer turns out to be wrong about a lot of things, but very right about medicine and diet and so on. And so then as they go on towards the end of the book, so they sort of lay out all of these guidelines and restrictions and so on the education. They lay out further sort of guidelines, which again are often restrictions about what types of professions and what types of occupations will be allowed in the city, how seriously they'll be taken. Again, the case of doctors, lawyers. He says the judges will come from older people who are themselves not bad, but have enough experience of life to recognize vice when they see it and therefore know how to deal with it. And so then he comes towards the end of when we come towards the end of the book, he says that there will be, he says, what's very important then is to watch these people who have been educated. And he says, to make sure that they don't lose the proper opinion, the opinion that they've been taught. And he says, we'll test them in both pains and pleasures. So not just make them do difficult things, but also present them with pleasures and see, will they deviate from the law? Will they forget what they're supposed to? Will they stop? I mean, what he says is that the best type of guardian would be the one who most wants the city to do well, who would even kind of identify his own well-being with the well-being of the city. And if they've been taught to be that way, again, will they sort of abandon those opinions because of pain, because of fear, because of distress, but also because of pleasure? He says we'll have to test them from both and say, will they become unjust either because of pain or because of pleasure? We'll have to test them for both. And he says in the very best ones, they will become the auxiliaries, or they will become the guardians. So the guardians will rule. And then he says, and the younger ones, the people who are still primarily warriors, they will be the auxiliaries who will help the guardians. And then as they come towards the very end of the book, Socrates says, well, hopefully we've provided them with a good education that will make the city functional. And Glaucon says, well, surely we have, right? And Socrates says, well, let's not be too sure. And he says, even though they've gotten a good education, we would still have to sort of go further and tell them stories to make sure that they were, even before that part between Glaucon and Socrates, Socrates starts to talk about how they maybe need to tell what he calls a noble lie. So he says, there some lies are noble. At 414c, Glaucon, he sort of says, could we, I said, somehow contrive one of those lies that come into being in case of need, of which we were just now speaking, some one noble lie to persuade, in the best case, even the rulers, but if not them, the rest of the city? What sort of thing, he said. Nothing new, I said, but a Phoenician thing. So Socrates is sort of trying to be casual. Nothing new, I said, but a Phoenician thing, which has already happened in many places before, as the poets assert, and have have caused others to believe. But one that has not happened in our time, and I don't know if it could, one that requires a great deal of persuasion. How like a man who's hesitant to speak you are, he said. You'll think my hesitation quite appropriate, too, I said, when I do speak. Speak, he said, and don't be afraid. And so he says, basically, so Socrates comes out and says what he says. And he says, basically what we should do is try to persuade them that their entire education, try to persuade the citizens of this city that their entire education, everything they've experienced so far in their life has just been a dream, that they've actually been underground, and that the earth is their mother and their nurse, and therefore they're all brothers and sisters in a very fundamental way, not just in a sort of metaphorical or sort of extended way, but that the earth is the mother of all of them. So the earth where their city is actually their mother, and that they're all brothers and sisters. And so that's the first part of the noble lie, as he calls it, is that they're attached to the earth as to a mother, and that they're attached to each other as actual blood relations. And then he goes even further, and he says, now the other part of the lie is that when they were underground, the god mixed certain metals into their soul. So some people had gold mixed into their soul, and he says those are the people who will become guardians, the actual rulers. Others had silver mixed into their soul, and he says those will become the auxiliaries, the people who sort of assist the guardians but are still primarily warriors. He says, and then some people had iron or bronze mixed into their souls, and he says those are the people who will be the producers or the laborers, the farmers and blacksmiths and so on. And he says, what we'll tell them is that the god has done this because he wants the right people to rule. So he says, we'll tell them that it's very, very important that only people with gold in their souls rule. And he says, for the most part, people will produce children that are like them. So, two gold parents will produce a gold child. But he says sometimes the opposite will happen. Sometimes two gold parents will produce a bronze-souled child. In other words, someone who wouldn't be a good ruler. I mean, obviously Socrates is making all this up. He calls it a lie. He doesn't believe this is what really happens. But he says, what we'll tell them is that sometimes two gold parents, two parents from the ruling class, may end up having a child who has a bronze soul. And he says in that situation, as he puts it, under no circumstances should they feel pity for it and try to keep it in the guardian class. They should see that it's a bronze child and demote it and make it down, send it down to be a farmer. And he says in the same way, sometimes people who have bronze souls or iron souls will produce golden children. And they should be elevated, taken out of that class, and made rulers. And he says again, we'll sort of stress to them that the god is the one who's responsible for this. The god is the one who's putting the metals in their soul. And if someone with an iron or bronze soul ever rules, the god will destroy the city. So he says, again, the idea here clearly then is to say, look, what we need to have is what people today sometimes call a meritocracy. What we need to have is the very best people ruling. And ruling should, again, Socrates is just telling this is a lie. Really what he's saying is that this should be based on people's natural abilities, how well they respond to the education, what their natural abilities seem to be, and how they respond to how well they can be educated. And so he says, if somebody is born to two farmers, but they have great natural ability, and they have the right kind of soul, that they're not too irrational or disobedient or whatever, they should be brought up and added and made part of the ruling class. The fact that they were born in a lower class shouldn't determine where they spend their entire life. In the same way, if someone is born to two rulers, but they have they're not very good at ruling, they don't have the necessary virtues, then they should be demoted down to a lower class, possibly down to the lowest class. And again, he sort of tries to say, the god will destroy the city if this doesn't happen. If somebody with the wrong metal in their soul rules in the city, then the god will destroy the city. So clearly trying to convince people, clearly trying to make them believe that they absolutely have to do this. Now, eventually this isn't enough. Eventually Socrates will say, well, we actually need to abolish the family. That even this myth, if we could get people to believe it, the pull of the natural love for one's own, the natural love for one's children would be so strong that it would overcome even fear that the god would punish the city, would destroy the city. So he says what we would actually have to do ultimately is just get rid of the family altogether. That will be the only way to make sure that people end up in the right class, doing the right thing. Make sure that the hierarchy in the city is actually based on the hierarchy in nature. So the hierarchy, the different classes, the differences in the city are therefore actually based on natural differences. So that the naturally best rule, the naturally second best end up as auxiliaries, and the least naturally gifted end up as the farmers and producers and so on. So he says, that's what we would need to do. Here he tries to say, maybe we could have a noble lie, a myth that would convince people. Eventually he says we'll have to abolish the family altogether. But in any case, here he just tells this story, and Glaucon is kind of surprised. And Socrates says, okay, so hopefully then we have people who will actually kind of do well. He says, but at the very end of book 3, he says, what's really worst is, and he goes back to this analogy of shepherds and sheep and sheep dogs and so on. He says, the worst is when dogs that are raised to protect the sheep instead become vicious and they become like wolves and eat the sheep themselves. And Glaucon says, you're right, that is terrible. And as Socrates says at 4:16, B, mustn't we in every way guard against the auxiliaries doing anything like that to the citizens, since they are stronger than they, becoming like savage masters instead of well-meaning allies? Yes, he said, we must. And wouldn't they have been provided with the greatest safeguard if they have been really finely educated? But they have been, he said. So Socrates says, don't we have to prevent this from happening in our city? The warrior class, which is obviously stronger than the non-warrior class, they have the weapons, they have the training. We can't have them, turn on the city and, destroy the city or enrich themselves by preying on the citizens. And Glaucon says, yeah, we shouldn't let that happen. And Socrates says, wouldn't the best safeguard be a fine education? And Glaucon says, well, they have that's already been done. And Socrates said, it's not fit to be too sure about that, my dear Glaucon. So Socrates suddenly seems somewhat skeptical. Was this the best education? In any case, it's not enough. He says, however, it is fit to be sure about what we were saying a while ago, that they must get the right education, whatever it is, if they're going to have what's most important for being tame with each other and with those who are guarded by them. That's right, he said. Now, some intelligent man would say that, in addition to this education, they must be provided with houses and other property, such as not to prevent them from being the best possible guardians, and not to rouse them up to do harm to the other citizens. And he'll speak the truth. And so Socrates explains, what is that like? And it basically turns out that they're not allowed to have any private property. They're really not even allowed to have much really of a private space, at least rooms that anybody can walk into at any time. So even with this education, even with the attempt to make them as moderate as possible, as reasonable as possible, as just, and so on and so forth, even with this elaborate education that begins when they're very young, all of this restrictions on what kind of stories they hear, what kind of music they can listen to, what kind of plays they can see, and so on, and then even with the noble lie on top of that, the myth, the sort of appeal to irrational, to try to make them believe these things, that they'll be punished if they don't rule correctly. Socrates says even that isn't enough. That really what we need to do is people who have this much power and therefore this much temptation, we would need to make sure that they could never act on that temptation by just not giving them a chance to do it, making it such that even if they wanted to steal, they have no place to put anything if they steal. Even their food will be tightly rationed. We'll say that since they have gold and silver in their souls, it's not okay. It's not lawful for them to touch actual gold and silver, which would debase the gold and silver in their souls. But again, just telling them that, even giving them religious beliefs to that effect, are not enough. You need to ultimately, Socrates says, just take away any chance they would have to actually abuse their power by simply not giving them any opportunity to do it. So sometimes students see Plato or Socrates as very optimistic, or they thought that people are just good, and if you just explain things to them, they'll always act in the right way. And that is kind of implied with the whole idea of virtue is knowledge, that no one does bad willingly, and so on. But again, as we talked about a little bit earlier on, what that actually means, what knowledge actually means in this case, is for Socrates, for Plato, something very deep, something very rare, not just simply hearing that something is bad for you and therefore never doing it. And again, you see it here that even with the best education that they can come up with, though again, Socrates is suddenly skeptical about that at the end, but even with this very rigorous, very intensive education that they've thought through quite a bit, which includes an irrational religious component that is designed to sort of go even beyond what reason could convince them of, even then, he says, that's not enough. Human nature is such that you can't trust them, that you can't simply explain to people, well, you shouldn't steal, and then they won't steal. So compared to some of the other people we might see in this class, Hobbes, Machiavelli, etc., Socrates and Plato may seem relatively optimistic and relatively high-minded. But again, you see here that there's a very clear sense of, look, human nature is such. People are willing to abuse their power. They're greedy. They're driven by all sorts of selfish desires. And so even with a great education, even with irrational beliefs trying to back up that education, you still need to actually just take away any opportunity that they may have to act against that education, to act unjustly, to act viciously. So again, in the end, not really that optimistic or that starry-eyed about what people are capable of.